So this is the first session on data loading. I'm in the Administrative Start Center called Getting Started, and you can see the portlet called data loading, and there's 6 different applications that are configured to load data. And we'll start with the first one, people. Now I'm going to jump to the related spreadsheet, sample spreadsheet that we provide on the wiki to talk through the type of data we have. So this is the spreadsheet. There are 2 tabs. The first one is the actual data, and then we provide some sample data. And then the second tab is the instructions. So if I jump there, it talks about what we're doing here. And really what we're loading here is 3 sets of data. We're loading a person, a user, and putting a user in a security group. So a person and user, the difference is a user is someone who actually logs into the system. Every user has a corresponding person record. However, a person doesn't need to be a user. If you have external users created in the system, let's say contact people for your vendors as an example, they would be people, but they wouldn't be users since they don't log into the application. Putting users in a security group gives those users access to primarily different applications, so they can perform whatever functions they're going to use based on their role. So if I scroll down a bit and look at the instructions, some of the obvious stuff, we always recommend you back up this file and work in a backup copy. We recommend that you use the spreadsheet. This is a .xls file, an Excel spreadsheet file. We recommend you use this document to fill in the spreadsheet, the first tab of data. But when we process it, we always process this a CSV file. So when you finish saving it, we then ask you to do a save as and save it in a format, a .csv format. And once you do that, that's the file you use to actually do the data loading. The data loading does not import .xls files, but it does import CSV or anything that's considered a delimiter separated spreadsheet. So if you look down below, the list of columns are there. Most of them are self-explanatory. We highlight which ones are required, as well as the size of the field and the data type. In the spreadsheet, which, as I mentioned, you have 3 sets of data. So if you look at this, starting at the top, from the person ID field down to the title, that data belongs to the person record. And then from the login ID down to the tape, that's user-related data. And then the last 2 fields are the group name and group user. That's where you assign a user to a specific security group. And when you use the spreadsheet, there is some behavior built into the spreadsheet. It's noted here. The first one, as an example, is when you put the person ID, we automatically shift that value over to the user ID and the group user. It just will minimize the amount of typing you have and reduce the chance for errors with mistyping. This happens in a few different fields, and you'll see this in most of the spreadsheets. Also noted here is on the user, there's a type field, and this is really a user-defined or a customer-defined value. There's 10 user types, 1 through 10, that are defined in the system. They don't have any business logic behind them. It's really a way for you, if you need to group your users in logical groups. It's if you don't need to do it, we just suggest you can leave it null or put every person or every user into the same group. Lastly is the security groups themselves. If you've seen some of the other documents we have on the wiki, we've talked about security groups, or they primarily tied to roles. What type of person uses the system, what they do within the system. And you can see the list there. There's a role, a group that supports those people who enter requests, a group for those people who plan and schedule work orders, someone who manages the inventory. These are the groups that are predefined out of the box with maximal fundamentals. In your deployment, your administrators may have chosen to create additional groups, which is fine. Whatever groups you have, as you load people and users, you can choose to assign them to one or more groups. So if I jump back to the first tab, at the top of the row 1 is always the column headers. So that row should always stay that way. Those in red are required fields. My example here, I populated pretty much every field. But again, the first set of fields are person related. The second set of fields are user related. And the third set is assigning the user to a group. One thing you'll see is that every user or person has 3 rows because I'm putting every user in 2 groups by default, one called max everyone and one called max default reg. These are groups provided with the system. They have some basic underlying configuration that every user should obtain. So we recommend that when you load, you always load users into those 2 groups, and then whatever additional groups that user should have based on how that person's going to use the system. So in my case, I put every user in 3 groups. This first user, Phyllis, is in the +JINI group, which is the request initiator, so a person who actually enters requests. You can put these users in multiple groups, not just these 3, but you can add 4, 5, 6, whatever number is appropriate. If they play multiple roles within the organization, they may need to belong to multiple groups. Now that I have my spreadsheet populated, as I mentioned earlier, before I go and do any loading, I would do a save as. And what I'm going to do is come here as the type, and I'm going to change it to be save as, delimited, CSV. And I'm going to say person user, CSV, and save this. I already had a previous copy. I'm going to overlay it. And this message talks about maintaining the type. You always want to answer yes. You want to basically maintain the type of the format for this file. So once you've saved it, now if I go back to Maximo, I'm in the Person app, and on the left here in the Common Actions, there's Application Import. So when I open this dialog, you'll see that it's already pre-configured for a certain object structure, which is an integration component that's used to load the data. You'll note that the limit, you can load up to 50 users at one time. That's the limit. So what I can do is I can browse for my file. Here I'm selecting the file that I just saved. Now when you do a load, you do have this option to do import preview. And what this basically does is it runs the load, but it doesn't save the data, and it would throw back any errors you might have. So what this is saying is my data is clean, it's loading all 5 users, so there's no errors. But if you mistyped something or had some error, they would show in this dialog. So basically you can catch the errors before they attempt to load if you want to. Now you may, if you remember, my spreadsheet had more than 5 rows, but if you look at it, it really had 5 persons, right? Phyllis, Lou, Brianna, Lester, Gus. So that's why it's 5. Even though there's 15 rows there, I'm putting the same person in multiple groups. So I'll do it again. So that was with preview, so this time I'm going to do it. Oh, actually, so this is a common mistake. I'll do it just so you see the error. I'm going to select the XLS file, not the CSV file, and I'll get an error. And the error is just telling you that it can't understand the file it's reading. Because it's not a CSV file, it's an XLS file, it didn't understand it. So the error message is somewhat undescriptive, but the point here is you'll see an error like this, and that's a reminder that you probably selected the wrong file, not the CSV file, but rather the Excel file. So let me select it again, select the CSV file again, and I'm going to load this up. And it brought in 5 records, and you can see at the bottom, here's my 5 records. Once the user's added, what will happen is that user will receive an email. That's key that you put the email address in the file, and it'll come to them with the password you assigned. So this is what the password, or rather the email, looks like. And you can see the password here is phyllisr_1_IBM. So they can use the URL provided to log in with that password, and they'll immediately be asked to change their password. That password's only good for a single login, so they'll have to reset their password. One other thing to note is the email only has the password, doesn't have the user ID. So you need to, which is the login ID. Your login ID should be something that they know. If they have a common login ID in your environment, if they have a common login ID in your environment, that they need to know what it is, so that ID can be used with the password sent to them in the